Good morning and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. My name is Bhante Suddhāso, and this morning we'll be looking at another discourse from the Buddha's teachings. So I'll start with paying homage to the Buddha, and then I'll go through the sutta, and then I'll take any questions at the end. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami. So the discourse for this morning is from the Anguttara Nikaya, chapter 9, sutta number 11, which is, here the name is given just as the Sihanada Sutta, which means the discourse of the lion's roar. But this one is specifically of Venerable Sāriputta. So in the suttas, the term lion's roar is normally used to refer to when someone has attained full awakening and they first declare it. So when they first give some Dhamma teachings or make some statement which makes it clear that they have in fact attained full awakening. So for example, we talk about the Buddha's lion's roar, and there's a couple of discourses which are called as much. And a handful of other places where it's the lion's roar of one particular monk or another. And again, it usually has this meaning. So some Dhamma teaching or statement which is an indication that the person has attained full awakening. So this particular discourse, again, is focused on Venerable Sāriputta, who was one of the Buddha's 4 chief disciples. So Venerable Sāriputta was the one of the 2 monks who were foremost in wisdom, the other one being Ayakema. So this discourse, I'll go ahead and start reading through it. It says, at one time the Buddha was staying near Savatthi in Jeta's Grove in Anathapindika's monastery. Then Venerable Sāriputta went to the Buddha, bowed, sat down to one side, and said to him, Bhante, I have completed the vasa at Savatthi. I wish to depart to wander the countryside. So the vasa is a 3-month period of time during the summer when the Buddhist monks traditionally commit to staying in one place for the entire 3 months. And commonly, after the end of that time, then commonly monks would go wandering. So they would wander from village to village, sleeping in the forest, seeing where their feet take them. And this is still the practice from time to time with different monks. Many monks will still do this practice of going wandering after the end of the vasa. So the Buddha says, Sāriputta, you can go at your convenience. And Sāriputta got up from his seat, bowed, and having paid respects to the Buddha, left. Not long after he left, a certain monk said to the Buddha, Bhante, Venerable Sāriputta insulted me and left without apologizing. And the Buddha says, the Buddha addresses one of the monks and says, monk, go and tell Sāriputta that the teacher summons him. So this is a little bit inconvenient. So Sāriputta here is just leaving on a journey, and then someone accuses him of misconduct right as he's leaving. So the Buddha sends someone to get Sāriputta to come back and respond to this accusation. So the monk goes to Sāriputta and tells him to come. And then at this point, so 2 of the other main disciples of the Buddha, Venerable Mahamoggallana and Venerable Ananda, then went throughout the monastery, summoning the other monks to come and witness this. So the discourse says, at that time, Venerable Mahamoggallana and Ananda went from dwelling to dwelling, saying, come forth, venerables, come forth. Now Venerable Sāriputta will roar his lion's roar in the presence of the Buddha. So this is indicating that these 2 monks already have a sense that this is going to be something remarkable. So perhaps they already knew that Venerable Sāriputta was fully awakened, and that this situation of somebody publicly accusing Venerable Sāriputta would create the opportunity for Sāriputta to demonstrate the fact that he was awakened. So the sutta continues. It says, Venerable Sāriputta went to the Buddha, bowed and sat to one side, and the Buddha said to him, Sāriputta, one of your spiritual companions has made this complaint. Venerable Sāriputta insulted me and left without apologizing. And Sāriputta replies, Bhante, someone who had not established mindfulness of the body might well insult one of their spiritual companions and leave without apologizing. I find this a very interesting statement. So here he's directly connecting mindfulness of the body with moral misconduct. So saying someone who does not have mindfulness of the body, someone who isn't well grounded in mindfulness of the body, that's the kind of person who might insult one of their companions and leave without apologizing. So the implication here is that somebody who has well-established mindfulness of the body would not behave in such a way. They wouldn't do that. They wouldn't mistreat their spiritual companions in that way. And Sāriputta continues. He says, suppose someone were to toss both clean and unclean things on the earth, like feces, urine, spit, pus, and blood. The earth is not horrified, repelled, and disgusted because of this. In the same way, I live with a heart like the earth, abundant, expansive, limitless, free of hostility and ill will. So this also is an interesting statement. And we find this simile also in other places in the suttas. This image of the earth being unbothered. Whether people throw trash on the earth or spit on the earth or urinate on the earth isn't bothered. The earth has its sense of dignity and immovability. So in the same way, the Buddha encourages us to develop a mind in the same way. So a mind that has that same vast, unshakable quality as the earth, that's unaffected. Whether people say kind things to us or harsh things to us, whether people treat us fairly or unfairly, then our own mind remains calm and undisturbed, just as the earth remains calm and undisturbed, regardless of what people put on it. So Sāriputta continues, suppose one were to wash both clean and unclean things in water, like feces, urine, spit, pus, and blood. The water is not horrified, repelled, and disgusted because of this. In the same way, I live with a heart like water, abundant, expansive, limitless, free of hostility and ill will. So again, the simile of a mind like water, in the sense that, again, water is not disturbed by what's put in it. So in the same way, our heart is not affected by anything that we come in contact with. So here, Sāriputta is talking in particular about the quality of equanimity, cultivating an undisturbable mind. And continuing with the similes, he says, suppose a fire were to burn both clean and unclean things, like feces, urine, spit, pus, and blood. The fire is not horrified, repelled, and disgusted because of this. In the same way, I live with a heart like fire, abundant, expansive, limitless, free of hostility and ill will. And then the same thing with wind. He says, suppose wind were to blow on both clean and unclean things, and so on. So this, again, the simile of cultivating a mind which is as unaffected by people's attitudes and perspectives as any aspect of nature. So nature just does what it does. It's not bothered by concepts of cleanliness or uncleanliness. It's not bothered by the behavior of people. So he says, in the same way, we cultivate our mind in the same way. A mind which is undisturbed by the conduct of others, and which also is not hostile or aversive towards others. And then he says, suppose a rag was used to wipe up both clean and unclean things. The rag is not horrified, repelled, and disgusted because of this. So again, here again, continuing with the simile. Then he says, suppose a person of a corpse worker tribe holding a pot and clad in rags were to enter a town or village, they would enter with a humble mind. So this is the example of a beggar. So someone, poverty-stricken person going into town to beg. He's saying they would do so with a humble mind. And he says, in the same way, I live with a heart like a person of a corpse worker tribe, abundant, expansive, limitless, free of hostility and ill will. This is actually very relevant because, of course, Buddhist monks are beggars, we're mendicants. So it's very important to keep this in mind. It's actually one of the critical aspects of the Buddhist monastic order since the very beginning, which is that it's an order of mendicants, an order of people who deliberately choose to be poor, who deliberately choose to have only the bare minimum of possessions, and deliberately choose to live on the donations and generosity of others. So here Sāriputta is talking about cultivating the humility and equanimity of a poor beggar who's entering town seeking for alms, seeking for support. Then he says, suppose there were a bull with its horns cut, gentle, well-tamed, and well-trained. He would wander from street to street and square to square without hurting anyone with feet or horns. He says, in the same way, I live with a heart like a bull with horns cut, abundant, expansive, limitless, free of hostility and ill will. So here the simile is of, again, an animal which has been well-trained, which has been trained to be harmless, trained to be non-violent. So in the same way, training one's own mind in the same way. And this is in line with a simile that we find in many places in the suttas, where the Buddha is very often comparing Buddhist practice to being like training an animal. And in the simile, we're the animals, by the way. So he uses similes like training horses. So training our own mind the way one would train a horse. In this case, is the example of a bull. Either way, it's recognizing that our own mind has these animalistic tendencies, tendencies towards feral behavior, but that with proper persistent training, just as an animal can be tamed and trained to behave harmlessly, in the same way our own mind can be tamed and trained to behave appropriately. Next, he says, suppose there was a person who was young, youthful, and fond of adornments, who had bathed their head. If the carcass of a snake or a dog or a human were hung around their neck, they would be horrified, repelled, and disgusted. Horrified, repelled, and disgusted. So I'm a little bit uncomfortable with how this is translated, but I'd have to take some time looking at the Pali words here. I think the wording here is a little bit too strong, but that's another time I'd have to look at this in more detail. So he says, in the same way, I'm horrified, repelled, and disgusted by this body. So again, this needs to be understood here as not in the sense of aversion or hostility, which is why I don't quite agree with the verbs that are used here, but rather the recognition that this body is not something to be attached to. It's not something to be held on to. It's not something to delight in, but rather it's just something to be recognized as part of nature. So the problem is not the body itself. The problem is when we have desire and attachment in relationship to the body. And Sāriputta then says, so suppose someone were to carry around a bowl of fat that was leaking and oozing from holes and cracks. Says, in the same way, I carry around this body that's leaking and oozing from holes and cracks. And then he concludes, someone who had not established mindfulness of the body might well insult one of their spiritual companions and leave without apologizing. So here again, he's emphasizing a clear awareness of the true nature of the body, of recognizing what a body actually is, recognizing that again, what is this body? So it's something which is made up of physical components. It's something which is constantly disintegrating, constantly leaking, constantly falling apart, constantly losing bits of hair and skin and flesh, dropping it off in our surrounding environment. So it's not something to be obsessed with. It's not something to identify with, but rather it's something to recognize its true nature with an unattached mind, with a peaceful mind. So the clear implication through all of this is Sāriputta is indicating that because of his own development of mindfulness of the body, then he's cultivated a mind which is completely peaceful, a mind which is completely non-hostile, which would never say anything harmful or offensive to anyone else. But also that he himself, because of training himself through mindfulness of the body, Sāriputta is saying that he himself is also impossible to disturb. So just as he would never willingly insult another person, he himself is impossible to insult because he would never be offended by anything that was said to him. He would never be bothered by anything. So there's also the implication here that Sāriputta is saying because of his own strength of practice, again, based in mindfulness of the body, there's no way that he would have insulted one of the other monks, at least not deliberately. But also he's saying that he's not bothered by the fact that somebody else is making this false accusation. Like it's not something which disturbs him or upsets him. So then the sutta continues. It says, then that monk, so in this case, it's the monk who accused Sāriputta. Then that monk rose from his seat, placed his robe over one shoulder, bowed with his head at the Buddha's feet and said, Bhante, I have made a mistake. It was foolish, stupid, and unwholesome of me to speak ill of Venerable Sāriputta with a false, hollow, untruthful claim. Please, Bhante, accept my mistake for what it is, and I will restrain myself in the future. So here the monk who accused Sāriputta admitted that the accusation was not true. And so he apologizes and says he won't do it again. And the Buddha says, indeed, monk, you made a mistake. It was foolish, stupid, and unwholesome of you to act in that way. But since you have recognized your mistake and have dealt with it properly, I accept it. And the Buddha then makes this very important statement. He says, it is growth in the training of the noble one to recognize a mistake, deal with it properly, and commit to restraint in the future. So again, it's not necessarily to be expected that our conduct will always be perfect when we're practicing Buddhism. But rather what is expected is that we will acknowledge our own mistakes. We'll recognize when we make mistakes and we'll do our best to make amends. And we're constantly committed to trying to improve our conduct, trying to become better. So even in this case where this person made a false accusation against a fully awakened monk, even in this case, because the person apologized, then the Buddha immediately accepted their apology. So it was immediately forgiven. And the reason why is because the person saw their mistake and apologized for it. So this is one of the aspects of Buddhist training is we're always trying to move forward. So even recognizing our own mistakes and committing to do better is an aspect of moving forward. And the sutta concludes, it says, then the Buddha said to Venerable Sāriputta, Sāriputta, forgive that silly man before his head explodes into 7 pieces right here. And Sāriputta replies, He says, Bhante, I will pardon him if he asks me. May the Venerable pardon me as well. Or forgive would be another word. It says, I will forgive him if he asks me to forgive him as well. So this also is an indication of Sāriputta's humility. So although Sāriputta hasn't done anything wrong here, Sāriputta is saying here that both of us should each forgive each other. Both of us here are committing to tolerate each other, committing to be patient with each other. And this is included. So the verb that's translated here as pardon or forgive, in Pali it's kamati, which also has the meaning of to be patient with, to accept, to endure, as well as meaning to forgive. It also has the meaning of to approve of. So it's not just forgiving each other, but also it's committing to patiently endure and accept each other's faults and particularities. So it's actually a very beautiful statement. It's not just saying I forgive you, but it's also saying I commit to patiently enduring your faults. I commit to accepting you as you are. So whether it's pleasant or unpleasant. And also the aspect here of mutuality. So in Buddhist practice, when there is apology, when there is a requesting for forgiveness, it's always mutual. It's always like, oh yes, I forgive you. And if I have done anything inappropriate, well, please forgive me as well. So there's always this idea that we're all mutually supporting each other in trying to become better people. So that's the end of the discourse. So at this time we can respect the sutta with 3 sadhus, and then I'll see if there's any questions. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And hello to the people joining in online. Hello to Ned, Rebecca, John, Jay, Matthias, Alyssa, Richard, Karuna, Manal, Christina, Jayanta, Sud, Bhumika, Miguel, Krenar, Yankee, Charles Lee, Johannes, and Amaranta. Welcome. And Kim. Yeah. And I see a couple questions here. So Sud says, Dear Bhante, seems like somehow he is talking about mindfulness of the body and the 4 Brahma Viharas. How are these two related? Yeah, so this is an important question, because normally we talk about mindfulness of body and the 4 Brahma Viharas as being 2 separate practices. But the sutta is in fact drawing a line between the 2. So the most obvious correlation is with equanimity. So as one cultivates mindfulness of the body in accordance with the Buddha's instructions, then one is training the mind in equanimity, in this peaceful, calm acceptance of the reality of things, this non-reactive serenity in the face of any experience. So yes, cultivation of mindfulness of the body then supports equanimity, the 4th of the 4 Brahma Viharas. It also works to clear away one's tendencies towards hostility, towards negativity and aversion, which then creates the space for developing loving kindness and compassion. So mindfulness of the body doesn't necessarily lead to the arising of metta and karuna, kindness and compassion, but it creates the space for that to be possible. By helping to clear away aversion and negativity from the mind. It makes it possible to cultivate kindness and compassion. Also, mindfulness of the body, the Buddha says we should cultivate a joyful mindfulness of the body. So that does create the conditions then for cultivating mudita, the sense of joyfulness, of selfless joy. That also is directly supported by mindfulness of the body. So yeah, the 2 practices are related in that practicing one will support the other. though just doing one does not necessarily mean the other happens by itself. So just doing mindfulness of the body doesn't necessarily mean that then you'll have metta and karuna. But also just practicing metta and karuna, kindness and compassion, doesn't necessarily mean that you'll have mindfulness of the body. So these two practices are mutually supportive, but not mutually inclusive. And Johannes says, what is the deal with the head splittings and head explodings? Is it symbolic? I've encountered it in a few other places in the suttas. Yeah, so this is something which it does show up a few places in the suttas. And usually it occurs in situations where someone is insulting or mistreating an awakened being. Then the statement is made of, oh, if this person doesn't fix their behavior, then their head will explode into 7 pieces. The other place where it comes up is with trying to intellectually examine something which is outside the domain of intellectual reasoning. So there it said, if one tries to ponder the imponderable, then one's head will split into 7 pieces. So it does seem to be metaphorical. Yeah, I think it's talking more about the mind becoming deranged rather than like necessarily physically. Your head literally physically explodes. I suppose it's not impossible. Could happen. But I think it's more metaphorical. It's more talking about the mind becoming deranged through extreme misconduct. Yeah, so in this case, like somebody making a false accusation of a fully enlightened monk, yeah, it's pretty disgusting behavior. You've got to have a pretty deranged mind to do something like that. And if you held on to that, even in the face of direct contravening evidence, then you would just become even more deranged. So yeah, I think it's more metaphor for the mind descending into twisted, delusional condition. And Kranar says, any book I should read to learn all this, please? Yes, the Sutta Pitaka. So read all the suttas. A good place to start is the Majjhima Nikaya, the middle-length discourses of the Buddha, and read through that from start to finish. And Kranar says, can you explain the nature of mind again, please? So this is a good question, but it's a bit off topic. So I recommend bringing this to the Friday night monk chat. So every Friday evening, we have our weekly chance to ask any questions you want. So it's 7:30 Eastern time in the US in the evening. Rebecca asked, do you have a regular practice at the monastery of admitting mistakes and asking forgiveness? How does that work? Well, the standard thing for this is the Uposatha. So every 2 weeks, the resident monks meet together to talk about any mistakes they've made in the past 2 weeks and to acknowledge their mistakes and commit to doing better. Also commonly, whenever a monk is arriving at the monastery or leaving the monastery, then there's a ceremony of asking forgiveness. But also any time when it comes up in community life, it's always good. If you know that you've done something offensive or inappropriate towards another monk, then you go to them and apologize and ask forgiveness. Yeah, so it's both done ceremonially at determined points in monastic life, but also it's something that's good to do informally whenever one knows that one has done something inappropriate towards another. And Kit says, any advice for dealing with someone who takes pride in never forgiving anyone? Well, forgive them and avoid them. Yeah, I mean, just don't put up with people like that. I mean, if you have any way to just not deal with them, that's usually the best option. If somebody's really not only committed to unwholesome behavior, but takes pride in unwholesome behavior, usually your best option is to just avoid them. Like, there's no getting through to people like that. So I recommend not even trying. And Brian has another off-topic question. Better to bring that one to monk chat as well. So it says, what practice is more of a direct path of progress towards realization, mindfulness of the body or the Brahma Viharas? Mindfulness of the body, without question. If it's done in accordance with the Buddha's instructions, which includes the perception of impermanence and non-self, then mindfulness of the body with the perception of impermanence and non-self, that will lead all the way to full awakening. And in fact, this is part of what Sāriputta is pointing to in the sutta, is Sāriputta is pointing to how with the foundation of his practice was in mindfulness of the body, and that was cultivated so well that he did eventually achieve full awakening. So yeah, absolutely. In terms of full realization, I would say mindfulness of the body is definitely the more complete practice that leads in that direction. We do, though, find in, for example, the Atthikkanagara Sutta, we find the Brahma Viharas mentioned as the beginning of a path towards full awakening, provided one, again, cultivates the perception of impermanence. But using the 4 Brahma Vihara practices as a starting point does seem to be a valid approach. But I would say, generally speaking, mindfulness of the body is a more thorough, complete, and effective practice for bringing the mind towards liberation. And that's the last question online. Are there any questions about this discourse from the residents here? No? Yes, go ahead.
Good. I had a question about the elements. I don't want to like humanize them or anything, but there seems to be an effect if you cold water or okay, the water is. It was said that the water is unbothered, but there seems to be certain reaction towards bad behavior towards the water. And, you know, it changes its consistency, or the wind changes, or the you know. So I wanted to ask about that.
Yeah. So of course, the behavior that we make towards nature changes its condition. But the point is that the water itself is not disturbed. Like, the water doesn't get angry because you heat it up or cool it down or put blood in the water or something. The water doesn't get angry. It changes its consistency, but not because of an emotional response.
So it's only on the emotional level.
Yeah. 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 Okay, and there's a few more questions online now. One more question here. So Amaranta says, is mindfulness of the body functioning to practice better the Brahma Viharas? I usually try to focus on Brahma Viharas only. I generally recommend having mindfulness of the body as your basic 24/7 foundation. And then when you practice Brahma Viharas, that basis of body mindfulness will mean the mind is already relatively focused and stable and clear, which then will make it easier to practice Brahma Viharas, because the mind will already be relatively focused and clear. So in that sense, yes, I do think that body mindfulness creates the conditions to more effectively practice the Brahma Viharas. And Minnie has another question that's a bit off topic. Let's see, if your family members don't like you following Dhamma and get angry at you, how should you respond? Yeah, it's a bit off topic. I recommend bringing that to monk chat on Friday evening. Yeah. And the other questions? Okay. Okay, so we can conclude the session with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we'll see you all next time.